Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's debate, one of YouTube's newest and most objective places for live debates on all sorts of topics. My name is Michael Temperato. Some of you may know me as Metaphysics Mike. I will be your moderator. Our topic tonight is one that cuts straight to the heart of how we understand Jesus and his mission. Did Jesus practice and preach the law of Moses? This is not a menial question because how we answer it shapes how we read the Gospels, how we understand Jesus. Was Jesus a teacher who operated fully within the Mosaic framework, or did he inaugurate something fundamentally new? Tonight, we have two capable presenters to unpack this very question. The first is going to be Matthew Janzen holding the affirmative, and the second is Carlos Xavier holding the negative. Let's go ahead and bring them on. Hello, hello. How are you guys doing tonight?
Doing good.
Good evening. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So, the format for tonight, we're going to have 10-minute opening statements. We're going to have 10-minute rebuttals each, then a 20-minute cross examination, and a 15-minute audience question and answer section. So if you have any questions throughout this debate, be sure to put them in the chat. Super chats will get answered first. And I don't know about you guys, but I am pretty excited for this. Let's go ahead and start with maybe you guys can introduce yourselves just in case people don't know you. Matthew, since you hold the affirmative, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm Matthew Janzen. I am a husband of 28 years, a father of 5, a grandfather of 9. I'm a pastor. I've been a pastor since probably about '07 to '08, Messianic congregation, Torah practicing. And yeah, I love to study the scriptures. That's what I do in all my spare time. So I pump septic tanks to make money. I've done that my whole adult life. So it's worked out pretty good for me. Good to be here.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming. Carlos, you as well. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thanks, Mike, and thank you, Matthew, for doing this again. We debated before on a related topic. So my name is Carlos. I grew up agnostic or not knowing where we came from and all that stuff. I became a Christian at 32 years of age and pretty quickly went into the so-called biblical Unitarian or non-Trinitarian system. And this is all of us here, I think. We're all like-minded Unitarians. And ever since, let's see, I've been working now for, I don't know, 5, 6 years full time in the ministry with Restoration Fellowship, online media manager, doing all kinds of stuff online. And pertaining to this debate, I just published my first book. Oop, can you see that? Jesus Practiced What He Preached. You can go to JesusPracticedWhatHePreached.com if you'd like to know more. But basically, I will hold the negative that Jesus came as the new covenant law maker, and what Paul later calls the law Messiah is not the law of Moses. So we'll talk about that. We'll discuss that. And I've debated before mostly about the Trinity or things related to the Trinity. Is Jesus God, the so-called eternal Son, or double nature and stuff like that? People like Matt Slick. And I just saw you, Mike, debate Al Garza. I debated him. So yeah, I've been doing a lot of that since about 2019. I think I'm closing on my 30th debate with this one. So thanks again for joining tonight.
Well, hey, thank you, Carlos. I appreciate it. And to all the viewers, we should have links to both their YouTube channels in the description. So if you want to hear more from them, be sure to go there and visit their channels. All right, we got two more things to go through real quick. Number one, guys, my job as a moderator, all I want to do is make sure that this is fair, that people get equal time. We obviously want to do our best not to cut off each other when we can and obviously answer questions. Now, beyond that, in a spirit of love for each other, I think all is fair game. The second thing, we have these 10-minute openers. When you get to 2 minutes, you're going to see this on the screen, 2 minutes left. Once you see that, you got 2 minutes to finish on up. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Beginning with Matthew Janzen, you hold the affirmative. So we're going to go ahead, take all of us off. And once you start talking, I will go ahead and begin the timer, and I'll get your slides up now.
Did Yeshua practice and preach the law of Moses? I believe the answer is unequivocally yes. To begin with, Yahweh sovereignly placed his Messiah in the proper home, a Torah-observant home. Yeshua was circumcised on the 8th day, Luke 2:21 from Leviticus 12:3. He was brought to the temple after the days of purification, Luke 2:22 from Leviticus 12:2-4. He was then dedicated to Yahweh as the firstborn son of the family, Luke 2:22-23 from Exodus 13:2 and 12. Yeshua's parents then offered the commanded sacrifice, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, Luke 2:24 from Leviticus 5 and chapter 12. Let me note here that Luke 2 shows that the law of Moses is synonymous with the law of the Lord, as they're used there interchangeably. Yahweh gave his law through the agency of Moses. So when Yeshua is obeying Moses, he is obeying Yahweh. To disobey Moses would be to disobey Yahweh. We read in Luke 2:41-42 that at the age of 12, Yeshua journeyed with his parents to Jerusalem for the Passover. This is obeying both Leviticus 23 and Deuteronomy 16. His parents had to have taught him the Torah, and during his childhood, he was growing in favor with God as he learned to obey, Luke 2:52. So it makes no sense for the promised Messiah to begin his life practicing the law of Moses and then switch to disobeying the law when he became an adult. That would be throwing away everything Yahweh placed him in and what his parents had carefully taught him. As an adult, around 30 years old, Yeshua's custom was to attend synagogue on Sabbath, Luke 4:16 from Leviticus 23:1-3. As was his custom in Luke 4:16 is parallel to the earlier according to the custom of Passover in Luke 2:42. So Yeshua was a Sabbath keeper. Yeshua also wore tassels on his tunic, obeying Numbers 15 and Deuteronomy 22. The hem of his garment that the woman with the issue of blood touched in Matthew 9:20 was actually the fringe or tassel of his tunic, as the Holman Christian Standard Bible and Legacy Standard Bible astutely translate it. The Greek word kraspedon used in Matthew 9:20 is used in Matthew 23 verse 5 to refer to the Pharisees' tassels, as well as in the pertinent Septuagint sections in Numbers 15 and Deuteronomy 22. So even these small outward commandments were very important to Yeshua. This is seen equally in Matthew 23, verse 23, where he said the Pharisees were correct for tithing their tiniest garden produce based on Leviticus 27:30 and Deuteronomy 14:22. After healing a leper in Matthew 8, Yeshua instructed the healed man to go and show himself to the Levite priest and offer the gift that Moses commanded. This was in obedience to Leviticus 14:1-22, where several sacrifices were required for ritual purification. Yeshua called the Jerusalem temple his father's house in John 2:16, and he always attended the holy city for the annual commanded festivals, John 2, John 5, and John 7, just as his Torah-observant parents had taught him. Even right before his death, he told his disciples that he had a fervent desire to eat the Passover meal. Yeshua upheld the law of Yahweh through Moses in his teaching. In the famous Sermon on the Mount, he said to the crowd in Matthew 5:17 that they should not even begin to think that he came to destroy the law or the prophets. The prophets here are not prophecies, but rather the prophets who would always call the people back to the Torah. Same as Matthew 7:12's admonition to do unto others, for this is the law and the prophets, as well as Matthew 22:40's wrap up that all the law and the prophets hang on the 2 great commands. Yeshua instead fulfilled the law. In context, fulfilling the law here means to properly interpret it in his teachings so that his followers know how to best obey it. Matthew 5 is all about his disciples' obedience to the law. He begins with, blessed are the poor in spirit, or blessed are you when men revile you. He's talking to people about their obedience. He says, you are the salt of the earth. Let your light shine that others see your good works. Do not think I came to destroy the law. See, the commandments are a lamp and a light, Proverbs 6:23, and by obeying the commandments, his followers shined their light. He said the law would last until heaven and earth passed away, and heaven and earth in the Gospel of Matthew, it doesn't have some hidden meaning. It means the actual heaven above and the earth below. We know this from Matthew 6, verse 10 in the next chapter, where we're told to pray, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." Heaven and earth have yet to pass away, so the Torah of Moshe remains firm. Further proof that Yeshua is speaking of the continuance of the law of Moses in his sermon is found in Matthew 5:22b, where he warns transgressors that they will have to stand before the Sanhedrin, a Jewish Torah-observant council of around 70 devout elders. Matthew 5:23 through 24 also proves the law of Moses firm when Yeshua says, if you are presenting your offering at the altar, but suddenly remember that your brother has something against you. The offering at the altar here is the same vocabulary in the Septuagint for the 5 types of offerings listed in Leviticus 1 through 7, burnt, peace, grain, guilt, or sin offering. He says to leave your offering, go reconcile with your brother, but then come back and present your offering on the holy altar. Verses 21 through 48 in Matthew 5 are not about Yeshua contrasting his teachings with Moses. They are about his interpretation of certain Torah portions versus the interpretation of others inside Judaism. He says our righteousness must surpass the scribes and Pharisees in Matthew 5:20, so it makes sense that he would then contrast some prevailing views of the Torah with his own. Second Temple period Jews often disagreed on how best to fulfill specific commands. These disagreements among brethren never meant any group or person considered the law of Moses irrelevant. Finally, Yeshua agreed with a Second Temple period Jewish scribe about keeping the law of Moses. In Mark 12:28 through 34, a friendly scribe, which is an expert in the law, approached him and asked, "What's the greatest commandment?" And Yeshua doesn't tell the scribe any new doctrine, but old established doctrine by quoting the Shema in Deuteronomy 6. Notice carefully that Yeshua doesn't quote verse 4, just quote verse 4 about the one Yahweh, but also verse 5 about loving Yahweh with all your heart, soul, and strength. This threefold love of the Shema is directly defined in 2 Kings 23:25, where King Josiah was said to have turned to Yahweh with all his heart, soul, and strength, according to the law of Moses. King Josiah is inspired commentary on Deuteronomy 6:5, and Yeshua said Deuteronomy 6:5 was the greatest commandment. Additionally, Yeshua cites the second greatest commandment about loving one's neighbor from Leviticus 19, verse 18. So, like a faithful Israelite, Yeshua always went back to the instruction manual of his Father. The scribe then praised Yeshua for his good Torah-based answers, and we know for sure that the scribe obeyed the law of Moses. Yeshua saw the scribe's response as intelligent. My biblical Unitarian brothers love pointing out how this scribe was not a Trinitarian, and they are correct. That Yeshua agreed with the scribe about the one Lord, or the one Yahweh. If they are consistent, though, they will also see that Yeshua agreed with the scribe on Deuteronomy 6, verse 5, which unequivocally teaches that loving Yahweh means obeying the law he gave through the agency of Moses. My friends, that Yeshua practiced and preached the law of Moses is one of the most provable doctrines in Scripture. It's so important because Yeshua said in Luke 6, verse 40, that every disciple, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. We're still being trained now. We've got some discipling yet to do. To be a good pupil, though, would be to listen to Yeshua, to his teachings. If you claim that Yeshua/Jesus is your teacher, your rabbi, your master, then you need to follow his teachings. That's what master or Lord means: boss, owner, ruler. And Yeshua always taught in his personal life, even from birth and ministry, all the way till death and even after resurrection, to obey the law that Yahweh gave through the prophet Moses. That's the end of my presentation, and I invite you to listen to Carlos very carefully.
All right. Thank you for that opening statement, Matthew. I have put a link to Matthew's channel in the comment section. Be sure to go check that out. And if you have any questions for Matthew, be sure to also put those in chat. Again, super chats get answered first. All right, now we are moving on to Carlos. Now, I know that you have a video. Looks like it needs to be rewinded a bit. Let's go ahead. I will take us all down. We will add that and make sure it is set.
Under the law of Moses or Messiah, and they are. Did Jesus practice and preach the law of Moses? No, because Jesus was sent, commissioned to preach and practice his own law, what Paul later terms the law of Messiah. First, a disclaimer. I categorically affirm that Jesus never sinned. He was not a sinner. He was the promised Messiah, the spotless and sinless Lamb of God. The question is, which law was Jesus under? The law of Moses or Messiah? And they are not the same law, as I will show. Again, Jesus never sinned, nor did he teach his followers then or now to sin. The new covenant had been foretold in part by Old Covenant prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, as well as some ancient rabbis. Church historian Del Allison quotes from a classic rabbinic commentary that the Torah which a man learns in this world is vanity compared with the Torah of the Messiah. This shows a pre-Christian Jewish understanding of the Torah of Messiah and not Moses. As a result, Jesus, and to a certain extent his followers, operated under a different law than the law given at Sinai to Moses. Hence, John 1:17 says that the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus, the Messiah. So here's a good question to start us off with. Where do we find the words of that new covenant law? After all, we know where to find the words of the old covenant law. And we all know that a covenant must consist of words. The answer is in the teachings of Jesus. Start with the so-called 6 antitheses he makes between the law of Moses and his own teachings in Matthew chapter 5. That is, you have heard it said, but I say to you. The contrasts included laws relating to murder, lust, marriage divorce, vows, oaths, lethal self-defense, and how to treat your enemies. If we take only the last two examples, we clearly see how Jesus effectively overruled the law of Moses. For example, under Moses, God commanded the Israelites not to show any pity, but Jesus says, do not resist an evil person. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek to them as well. Jesus goes on to say, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your heavenly Father. The Old Covenant system that began with Moses at Sinai, pertaining to personal and judicial punishment, have clearly been changed here. Jesus is not repeating the law of Moses. He is contrasting it with his own law. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus and his apostles are shown not keeping other Old Covenant laws, like the weekly Sabbath. When Jesus declares that you can break the Sabbath, yet be innocent in Matthew chapter 12, Jesus himself categorically saying he was, quote, working on the Sabbath in John chapter 5, and declaring that nothing which is on the outside and goes into you, such as food, of course, can make you unclean. With this command, Jesus pronounced every kind of food clean, according to Mark chapter 7. Jesus clearly overturns the food laws from Leviticus 11 here. Again, the clear breaking of these Mosaic laws did not mean Jesus or his apostles sinned. They were already operating under a different system as taught by God himself. In John 7, Jesus told his fellow Jews, it's not my own teaching, but it comes from the one who commissioned me. If anyone is willing to do God's will, he will fully recognize this teaching and where it comes from God or from my own initiative. The man whose teachings come from himself is looking for glory for himself, but he who is looking for the glory of him who sent him, that man is genuine and there is nothing false about him. This means the new covenant law of Jesus was inaugurated with his preaching and practice, not just his death, as Jesus said at the Last Supper. In Luke 22, verse 20, he calls the new covenant an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you. Compare the words of the Old Covenant given by Moses and later confirmed by the shedding of blood. Also note how Jesus combines here Jeremiah 31's promise of a new covenant with that of Exodus 24, verse 8, the blood of the covenant at Sinai. The new covenant in my blood points to his death as the sacrificial act that later confirmed this new covenant. As Jesus says in Luke 24, verse 44, these were my words while I was still with you, that everything which is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled. His death is not the new covenant. His death ratified the new covenant. After all, how can you agree and confirm a blank document? That is, the blood ratified his new covenant law like a signature on a document. After all, no one would put their signature on said blank document. That is, a document without any words. Therefore, the new covenant law of Messiah came into effect with the ministry of the Messiah, and was officially certified at the cross. As a result, at his first appearing, Jesus was already functioning as the high priest mediator of that new covenant law, as Hebrews 9:16 goes on to say, for where there is a covenant, there must of necessity be the death of the one who made it, that is, the covenant. So to say the new covenant law begins only at the cross implies that Jesus did not practice what he preached. This would turn Jesus into a hypocrite. Jesus never said nor meant, don't do what I say now, just wait until after I die. Instead, Jesus asked, why do you call me Lord, Lord, but do not do what I say? Later, Paul was right to say, imitate me as I imitate Messiah, because Jesus himself practiced what he preached, again, his own new covenant law. This further explains why Paul states in 1 Corinthians 9, I myself am not under the law that is of Moses. Yet Paul adds, not myself being outside the law of God, but under the law of Messiah. Note that for the apostles, the law of God is the law of Messiah and not Moses. Paul asks in Galatians 5, if I were still preaching circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? Just as the song, If I Were a Rich Man, means that the singer is not a rich man, Paul clearly here means he was not preaching circumcision. When Paul went to meet the apostles in Jerusalem, he says that not even Titus, who was with me, was compelled to be circumcised, although he was a Greek. The apostles and elders agreed with Paul that Gentiles should not be circumcised in order to obey the law of Moses. They understood that circumcision belonged to the Old Covenant, not the New Covenant. The apostles recognized that Gentiles were accepted by faith. They agreed with Paul that Gentiles were not to be made slaves under the law of Moses. As the Jerusalem church asks in Acts chapter 15, verse 10, why would anyone want to challenge God by burdening the Gentile believers with a yoke that neither we nor our ancestors were able to bear? Hence, Jesus is called the mediator of a new covenant, and his followers, like the apostle Paul, ministers of that same new covenant. 2 Corinthians 3, Paul says that God made us competent to be ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit, because the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Also note how Paul goes on to say in this same chapter that the covenant at Sinai, what he calls the ministry of death, written in letters carved on stone tablets, is a clear reference to the 10 Commandments that represented the whole law of Moses. For Paul, the law of Moses and the law of Messiah are clearly two different laws because they belong to two opposing covenants, leading to two different outcomes. One, punishment and eventual destruction, or 2, the life of the age to come, immortality in the kingdom of God. So if you identify as a Christian, you should know what Jesus himself practiced and preached so you can follow him.
All right. Thank you both for your opening statements. I have a link to Carlos' channel in the comments. Be sure to go and check that out. All right. Now we are going to move to our rebuttals. Both presenters are going to have 10 minutes, and we are going to start with Matthew Janzen. All right. If you have anything that you would like to share on screen again, Matthew, just let me know. Let's go ahead, get you on, and I will go off and start the timer when you start talking.
Carlos began by stating that rabbinic commentary on Ecclesiastes helps establish a new Torah of Messiah over against the Torah of Moses. But Kohelet Rabbah 11:8 does not mean that Messiah brings a different Torah. It instead points to a higher degree of spiritual insight. A parallel is found in Midrash Tehillim 31:4. In this world, a person studies and forgets. In the world to come, I will put my Torah in their inward parts. They will never forget. Torah of Messiah in rabbinic commentary refers to Torah in the era of Messiah. The Messiah equals the master Torah teacher. This is the same way the New Testament uses the phrase law of Messiah, the law of Moses as taught and exampled by Yeshua Messiah. Matthew 5:21-48 was brought up as contradictions between Moses and Jesus, and Carlos focused on two examples I'm going to respond to directly here. Concerning an eye for an eye, if you look at each Torah portion that uses this phrase, you'll see that each use is in the context of judicial procedure. The judges of Israel were to carry out Yahweh's vengeance in rendering verdicts for court cases. It's similar to how a judge gives a ruling today in a criminal case. So if we rule out eye for an eye altogether, should judges today never penalize a convicted rapist or murderer? But what if a person takes these judicial texts and begins to apply them to everyday common occurrences? Well, it appears that is what some were doing. Instead of overlooking everyday minor infractions, slap on the cheek, taking away a tunic, carrying something 1 mile, they were using judicial law to justify personal vengeance. Yeshua taught that we should instead seek for an everyday life of peace, echoing Proverbs 20:22. Do not say, I will repay evil. Wait for Yahweh, and he will help you. Next, we have Yeshua saying, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Yeshua said before each section there in Matthew 5, you have heard it was said rather than it is written, because he was referring to an interpretation of something that was written. Case in point, the law of Moses directly says love your neighbor in Leviticus 19:18, but nowhere directly says hate your enemy. This shows that Yeshua is responding to a potential interpretation that one might draw from love your neighbor. The law of Moses instead taught in Exodus 23:4-5, if you come across your enemy's stray ox or donkey, you must return it to him. If you see the donkey of someone who hates you lying helpless under its load and you want to refrain from helping it, you must help with it. This is further seen fulfilled in the wisdom literature from those who practiced the law of Moses. Proverbs 25:21, if your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. And if he is thirsty, give him water to drink. The prophet Elisha did just this to the Aramaean army in 2 Kings chapter 6. Yes, there are cases where Yahweh commands Israel to slay certain enemies, but these are enemies of Yahweh, not just enemies of individual Israelites. Even Yeshua himself in the parable of the 10 minas in Luke 19 says, but these enemies of mine, who did not want me to reign over them, bring them here and slay them in my presence. The love that we are to have for our enemies is illustrated in the sunshine and rain that Yahweh sends to all people on the earth, Matthew 5:45. We imitate our Heavenly Father when we show common grace to all people. Carlos brought up the grain field incident in Matthew 12 as proof that Jesus allowed all Sabbath breaking, but notice carefully that Jesus defends his disciples by using arguments from the books of 1 Samuel and Numbers, not by making up something new. In 1 Samuel, David was allowed to eat the showbread, even though the law said in Leviticus 24 only the priest could eat it. but this was because of David's hunger. Thus, the Hebrew Bible shows that human need is greater than temple service. Yeshua systematically stacks on another argument. On the Sabbath, the priest in the temple continue to offer sacrifices, even to a greater number. So they technically break Sabbath, but they are innocent because the temple service laws are greater than Sabbath. So Yeshua's argument goes like this. 1, human need is greater than temple service. 2, temple service is greater than Sabbath. Therefore, 3, human need must be greater than Sabbath. Yeshua did not defend his disciples because the Sabbath was being abolished, but because the Hebrew Bible itself defended what they were doing. See, all Yahweh's commandments through Moses are good, but sometimes 2 commands butt heads, and one must override the other. Yeshua showed some Jewish leaders that they too believed just this, where in John 7, he said that they would perform circumcision even if the 8th day of a boy's life landed on Sabbath. But circumcision is an act of cutting, and thus it constitutes work. 2 commands then butt heads. In this case, the positive command to circumcise overrides the negative command to do no work on Sabbath. Yeshua was never caught doing his carpentry work on Sabbath. The work he did on Sabbath was redemptive work, acts of compassion, healing, relieving people of burdens. Yahweh himself delivered the Israelites from Egypt on a Sabbath, the 15th day of Abib and first day of unleavened bread. They had to march out of Egypt on this high day because their deliverance, redemption, was more important than the technical aspects of Sabbath. This is why Yeshua says in John 5:17, "My Father is working until now, and I myself am working." Working in the sense of manual labor? No. Working in the sense of healing a man who had been unable to walk for 38 years. Yeshua delivered the man from his burden on Sabbath. And then he told him, "Pick up your mat, carry it." That mat was the only possession this diseased man had. So the compassionate thing to do was tell him to take it with him. Yeshua likens his healing a man's entire body on Sabbath with circumcising one part of a man's body on the Sabbath. I think I have time for one final point in this rebuttal here. Yeshua did not overturn the dietary law in Mark chapter 7 or Matthew 15. That's not even the subject of either of those chapters. The beginning of Mark 7 shows that this is a dispute about ritual purification or purity. The Pharisees asked Yeshua, "Why do your disciples eat bread with defiled or common hands, breaking the tradition of the elders?" The Pharisees didn't ask, "Why do your disciples eat pork, breaking the law of Moses?" In the mind of these Pharisees, a Jew could become ritually unclean or impure by eating food, kosher food, kashrut, that had touched something else ritually unclean. Yeshua first challenges them by telling them that they're the ones that disregarded what Moses said in order to keep their tradition with the Korban rule and a neglect of their parents when their parents aged and needed to be honored or taken care of. So Yeshua upholds the law of Moses here in this text. He's not going to rebuke them for disregarding Moses and then turn right around and disregard Moses himself. And notice in Mark 7:9-10, he says that they set aside the commandment of God, the Almighty. And then in verse 10, "For Moses said, honor your father and your mother." The words God and Moses are being used interchangeably in those two verses. If you continue reading, when Yeshua says in Mark 7:15, "Nothing that goes into a person from the outside can defile him," he is addressing Jews who might who might eat without performing the hand washing. He's not talking about drinking blood or snorting cocaine or eating pork. If something ritually impure was on a Jewish man's hands when he touched his food and he ingested it, Yeshua believed that it was purified through the stomach. The man did not have to immerse in water and wait until evening to be clean, as he did with other laws or laws of impurity. And that is because the digestive process of the man, verse 18, purges all foods, verse 19. While some translations, like the NIV, read, "In saying this, Jesus declared all foods clean," the Greek text does not read that way. It reads either katharizon masculine katharizon masculine or katharizon neuter, pantatabromata. Now, I lean towards a neuter original here in the Greek text, meaning that the stomach purges away impurities through the digestive process, but recent studies in scholarship have shown how the masculine variant could be read as connected with ton anthropon, the man, in 18b. This was all an intramural debate amongst Torah observant Jews. I'm going to stop it right there. I look forward to discussing more text during the cross-examination period. Thank you all for listening.
Awesome. Thank you, Matthew, for that rebuttal. We are going to now go ahead and we will shift the stage over to Carlos for his 10-minute rebuttal. Carlos, it will begin the moment you first start talking.
Okay. Yeshua's childhood, Matthew's first point. We all know this and agree. He was raised under the law, of course. No one is denying Jesus that, but this debate is about the beginning or the start of Jesus' ministry. You know, it's like appealing to Abraham or Moses' pagan upbringing in order to question their later beliefs. He says that his life practicing the law of Moses only to abandon it. So that makes no sense. Now, that's a straw man because Janzen replaced what Jesus actually says, that he came to fulfill the law, not to abandon the law. That's not what the text says. The problem is to ignore Jesus' own claim to be Lord, which is master, owner over the Sabbath. He says he's even greater than the temple. He was not therefore bound by that old covenant law of Moses, but by his own law, what Paul later calls the law of Messiah in 1 Corinthians 9:21. Apologies for the wrong slide, I believe, in my opening. 1 Corinthians 9:21 and Galatians 6:2, the law of Messiah. Now, why is that? Because Jesus was greater than Moses. Hebrews 3:3, Moses was not his Lord, therefore he was not under the law of Moses. Matthew says he attended the synagogue. Just because you go to a synagogue doesn't mean you're keeping the Sabbath. In other words, you leave the synagogue, it doesn't mean that you're not working out all the rest of the day. And again, he was born and brought up Torah keeping. And note the past tense, he was raised in that law. And where else was he supposed to go, by the way? To pagan temples to convert Gentiles? I mean, he did say, I was commissioned only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, did he not? But as we know later in his ministry, in his mission, changed. Yes, the mission of Jesus changed. It says that he marveled about a Gentile, and Jesus said, I have not found such great faith with anyone in Israel. Now, that's a weird thing for a Torah observant Jesus to say. Not once that in the synagogue, his mission was to announce the gospel of the coming kingdom and proclaim his messiahship. Matthew says about Matthew 12 and picking grains on the Sabbath day. Well, Jesus said very clearly, Matthew 12, verse 6, the text says, or Jesus said, they break the Sabbath, yet are innocent. Now, he was referring to the temple priests. Yes, he's referring to David and his friends. And he's taking those two exceptions from the Old Testament, true. But he's making the exceptions the new rule now, the new law. That's the whole point of the story. Matthew talks about healing the leopard, and then he orders him to go present the gift, the sacrifice commanded by Moses, but Matthew left out the key phrase. Jesus says, as a testimony to them, do that for them, for the Torah keeping priest. It's understandable why Matthew left that out, because the point is to prove Jesus, he's proving his messianic credentials there, that he's the one healing. There's no need for the temple. He's the one purifying people. There's no need for the priests. And all these are works prophesied in scripture, fulfilling the two witness requirement, by the way, that is found in the Gospel of John. Jesus said he came, again, he came to fulfill, not abandon the law. And the prophets, not prophecies. He came to fulfill the prophets, not prophecies, and the writings. Matthew says he went to Jerusalem for the annual feast, just as his parents taught him. Again, where was he supposed to go? He was sent to seek the lost sheep of Israel. After his resurrection, most of the apostles, whenever they were in Jewish communities, regularly went to synagogues to teach, like Paul and Peter. Like Jesus, they saw it as an effective mission work to the Jew first. Matthew says just before his death, he fervently desired to eat the Passover meal. Yes, because Jesus fundamentally transforms the Passover meal, the meaning and significance, to establish a new law, a new commandment, the Christian communion service. He replaces, just read it. Jesus says, the bread is now his flesh, the wine is now his blood. And then he says a key thing: do this in remembrance of me. The Passover was in remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt after Moses takes them out of Egypt from slavery. So Jesus is in effect saying, don't do this no longer for the old stuff, the Exodus from Egypt. Do it to remember me, because I'm the Messiah. As Paul later says and makes clear in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7, for the Messiah is our Passover lamb. He has been sacrificed. He replaces that system. Matthew quotes Matthew 5:17, but he seems to think that Matthew 5:17, Jesus by fulfill means to continue to observe and practice the law. That's what I think Matthew thinks it means. But in Matthew and across the whole New Testament, it refers to the completed prophetic fulfillment, not continuous repeated observance of the Torah. Now, the New Living Translation, which is a paraphrase, I think it really captures the sense of Matthew 5:17 by putting, I came to accomplish their purpose, the purpose of the law, the prophets, and the writings. Now, right after saying this, Jesus goes on to sometimes, as I have argued in my opening, to revise, expand, even make tougher at times other things completed or overturned in the Torah. As I said, Jesus contrasts his words with the law of Moses when he says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away, towards the end of Matthew, in Matthew 24, verse 35. Now, Jesus said, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you, and I say to you. That's not the proper way to observe and live out the Torah. No rabbi would say that the written Torah says X, Y, and Z, but I cancel that and declare Y. The people acknowledge he wasn't just another rabbi offering an improved halakha, an interpretation or right way of following the Torah. In Matthew 7:28, when Jesus finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed by his teaching. Matthew 7:29, because he taught them like one who had authority, not like their experts or scribes in the law. So he acted and spoke above every so-called rabbinic interpreter, halakha, or whatever. The early church understood him in this way, which is why they did not remain Torah observant, as I will argue. Note that the scribe contrasts the Shema with burnt offerings and sacrifices in Mark 12, temple ritual central to Mosaic law. Jesus affirms this contrast, showing that law fulfills what the ceremonial law only pointed to. Again, Christians are under the law of Messiah, which is law fulfilled by the Spirit, not by the letter of the law, as Paul says clearly in 2 Corinthians 3. To say the law of Moses is the same as the law of Messiah are to mix up, to confuse two things, the old covenant and the new covenant. It's to violate the same logical dictum that similarity does not mean identity. And then lastly, he says biblical Unitarians love pointing out that the scribe in Mark 12 was not Trini, and that Yeshua would agree, or Jesus. Why don't they also love their agreement on Deuteronomy 6:5? Now, the voice from heaven said, this is my son, listen to him, not Moses. John 14:15, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And the person who has my commands and carries them out is the one who loves me, and the one who loves me will be loved by my Father. Thank you.
All right, Carlos, thank you for your 10-minute rebuttal. All right, we are now going to shift over to what is one of my favorite parts of these debates, and that is the cross examination. We are going to start with you, Matthew, since you have the affirmative. Again, my goal here is just to help make sure this is fair, that questions are getting answered. And beyond that, again, in good love, I'm sure everything else is fair game. So 20 minutes each. Matthew, the moment you start, I will begin your timer.
How are you doing, Carlos?
Good.
You sweating yet? No?
Well, some of the things you're saying are making me sweat, but go ahead. I mean, your conclusions are making me sweat.
Oh, it's good to talk to you again, buddy. Good to talk to you. First question. Did
Yes.
the family that God allowed Jesus to be born into observe the law of Moses?
Say it again, please?
Did the family
Yes.
that God allowed Jesus to be born into, Joseph and Mary, did they observe the law of Moses?
Yes.
Did Joseph and Mary teach Jesus to keep the law of Moses as a little boy?
Yes, but that's not the point of this debate, as I said,
Okay.
but go ahead.
Okay. So you do believe that Jesus was keeping the Sabbath as a child and a young adult?
Same as Paul the Apostle, and yep.
During his childhood, when he was keeping the law of Moses, Jesus, as he was taught, was he finding favor with God during this time?
Of course.
Okay. So on what day or at what age was Jesus allowed to stop keeping the Sabbath he was raised to keep?
Actually, if you've listened to my sermons and various videos, I believe the new covenant as such begins with John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, and they are the messengers of the new covenant. So the interpretation of Malachi 3 is that they are the ones prophesied that they will come and give this new covenant or start the new covenant, establish it. So actually it begins with John the Baptist. And then obviously Jesus, I think if you have to put a timestamp on it, at his baptism, the official beginning of his messianic ministry.
So you think before his baptism he was a strict Sabbath keeper, but after his baptism he was allowed to break the Sabbath?
Well, he is the new covenant lawmaker. And again, when we say breaking the Sabbath, I mean, Jesus says at Matthew 12, verse 6, very explicitly, he's not a lawbreaker because he's the Messiah. So he's establishing what God is only teaching him or communicating to him, as the voice from heaven itself says. So he's beginning this new messianic era, if you want to call it. And I do agree with you, by the way, Matthew, on your understanding of some of those rabbinic sources, they did understand that the Torah
Okay.
Messiah, as they call it,
Okay.
begins with the coming of Messiah.
Okay. Do you have a Bible there with you, Carlos?
Yes, sir.
Let's go to Luke chapter 1. I want to go through a couple of verses here and just get your thoughts. Let's do
Sure.
Luke 1.
Yep.
Verse 9, where it says, according to the custom of the priestly office. What custom is that?
I'm assuming a custom from the book of Leviticus.
Okay, that's close enough. All right, now look at Luke 2:27. We can take our time. I'm not in a hurry. Luke 2:27.
Yes, sir.
And he came in the Spirit into the temple, and when the parents brought in the child Jesus to carry out for him the custom of the law. What custom is that?
Is it circumcision there?
That would be part of it. Okay. Now, Luke 2:42.
Yes, sir.
And when he became 12 years old, they went up there according to the custom of the feast. What custom is that?
Of keeping the feast.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so all of these Lucan phrasings show obedience to the Torah. Why then would Luke 4:16, when the author explicitly says that Jesus entered the synagogue as was his custom, why would that not also in vain show that Jesus kept the Torah as an adult?
Well, because as I said, just because he entered the synagogue, or the apostles after his resurrection go to the synagogue or go to the temple courts, by the way, which is what it says right in the book of Acts. They're preaching the gospel of the new covenant kingdom, as I would call it. So Jesus is fulfilling his messianic calling, saying to them, this is fulfilled in front of your ears, that you know in essence, that he's the Messiah, and preaching now the gospel of the kingdom.
In Luke 4:15, before 16, verse 15, and he was
Yep.
teaching in their synagogues, being glorified or praised by all.
Yep.
When it says he was teaching in their synagogues, do you take that to mean on the Sabbath he was teaching in the synagogues? Verse 15.
Yeah, that's what it says. The synagogue
Okay.
on the Sabbath day. Yep.
Okay. And at the end of verse 15, he was being glorified or praised by all. Who is the all there? Would that be the Jewish people?
Yeah, sure.
Do you think they would praise a Sabbath teacher in the synagogue if he broke Sabbath?
Well, what they're praising is what he's reading, right? The gospel. So he's reading the words of Isaiah. I can praise that to this day. I can pray the Lord's Spirit, since he's anointed to preach the gospel to the poor, announce the release of the captives, etc. I can praise that to this day, but it doesn't mean I'm getting circumcised in the flesh and killing a lamb every Passover. So,
Okay. When Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5 that he did not come to abolish the law, what does the word abolish mean?
destroy, do away with.
Okay. Did Jesus destroy or do away with the Sabbath?
He fulfilled the Sabbath. He fulfills the various, what Paul goes on to call, works of the law. So the Sabbath would be part of the Jewish calendar. I believe Paul calls a shadow in Colossians 2:16 and 17. He fulfills the whole temple Levitical system per the letter to the Hebrews, or the book known as the Hebrews. So he
Okay.
fulfills those certain things here.
So he fulfilled the Sabbath. So once he fulfilled it, is it now done away with?
He gave us the freedom in Mark 2, as you know. He calls us, in essence, lords of the Sabbath. So he declared himself a Lord. And I'm glad we can agree, by the way, that Lord doesn't mean he's Yahweh, he's God.
Yeah.
So
I'm
Lord
glad
is
we can
master.
agree on that too.
Yeah, praise God. Thank God. And, owner, master. So he has mastery over the Sabbath. So look, if you want to rest on the Saturday, that's fine with me. But I think out of an obedience to the new commandments taught by Messiah, I don't think that's right.
In verse 17, when he says, "Do not think I came to abolish the law or the prophets."
Sorry,
And then
Matthew 5,
Matthew
right?
5, verse 17. Yeah, I'm in
Yes.
Matthew 5. Do
All
not
right.
think I came to abolish. And then look at verse 19. Whoever then annuls, some translations say breaks, loosens, luo there in the Greek. Do you not see how that would be? Those two verses are equal. Do not think I came to abolish would be whoever then annuls or breaks. Do you not think those are parallels there?
Yes. Now, these commandments could mean to the commandments he just gave, by the way. So what we call the Beatitudes, or the blessings. So the first, what is it, 10, 11 verses. So those are
But in
commandments.
verse,
Blessed are the merciful. Yeah, go
yeah, I
ahead.
understand the Beatitudes. But in verse 17, when he said, "Do not think I came to abolish the law or the prophets," I didn't come to abolish, but fulfill. You agree that's the law of Moses he's talking about, right?
Of course.
Okay,
And
so in verse
it's
19,
fulfilled.
then, in
Yeah.
verse 19 is a therefore, whoever then annuls. You don't see how annuls is equal with abolish in verse 17?
If you can clarify I think you're trying to get what's your point? If you can make it, maybe I can.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to make it through a question.
Yeah. Well, it's all right. Make that as a statement, and I'll try and.
So I see that in verse 17, Yeshua says, "Do not think I came to abolish." And
Right.
so then in verse 19, as his students, whoever then annuls, it
Right.
seems like abolish and annuls would
Oh, I
be
get it. I got it.
synonyms there.
I
So
got it.
that annuls is abolish. If abolish is talking about the law of Moses in verse 17, annuls would be talking about the law of Moses in verse 19.
I
Correct?
got you. Got you. Well, it would be contradictory to do that
Mm.
because, right, abolish means abolish, do away with, destroy, right? Now
He-
the subject is the law of Moses, we agree. But then the
yes.
question in 19 is about the commandments. So
Mm.
what commandments? Is it going back to the law of Moses? Most of us don't believe that, as you know. We believe that the commandments are the ones now he's given that are being communicated by God the Father himself to his Messiah, his anointed one. And then either you can take commandments as the ones that have already been spoken, as I said, the Beatitudes, the blessings in the first 10, 11 verses, or it can refer commandments to the things that follow that we know we disagree, where the antitheses
Yeah.
of Matthew. So
So verse 17, do not think I came to abolish the law. That's the law of Moses.
yeah.
Okay. Verse 18, for truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law. What law is that?
Oh, Moses.
Okay. Verse 19, whoever then annuls one of the least of these
Oh,
commandments.
hold
What?
on until they're fulfilled, right?
Right. Until all is accomplished.
Yeah, the
Until
law
all is
is
accomplished.
fulfilled, right?
All right. But that word law there is the law of Moses in verse 18, right?
Yes, sir.
So whoever then annuls one of the least of these commandments, you saying
Right.
that's a different law right there?
Yeah, it has to be
Hmm.
because it contradicts itself. You see what's happening? So you're making it contradict to me, to my ears. I'm not saying you're doing this on purpose, by the way, but it sounds contradictory the way you're trying to read it. But
Thank
if
you
we
for.
read it as the commandments, it goes on to say, as New Testament in Revelation, whoever keeps his commandments, the martyrs, they died for keeping the commandments of God. So the question now is, what do the New Testament writers mean by the commandments of God? Do they
Mm,
mean Levitical priesthood,
mhm.
the all those laws, or yeah?
Okay. So if Jesus is introducing new law here in the Sermon on the Mount, why does he teach the ongoing validity of the Sanhedrin in Matthew 5:22? Don't curse your brother, don't speak bad language toward your brother, or you'll have to go before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish
Right.
council of elders. Why is he mentioning the Sanhedrin if this is new law?
Well, he's making a simple practical example at that time. The Sanhedrin is standing at that time. So he's just pointing to what the law says and what
Okay.
they do when you take it to the Sanhedrin.
Okay. And then in verse 23, therefore, if you are presenting your offering at the altar,
Hmm.
isn't that a sacrifice, an animal
Yes.
sacrifice right there? Okay,
Yep.
so why is he talking about people still presenting their offerings at their altar if he's teaching them this new law?
Right. Because the law here, if you go back to 21, the context is, you have heard that it was said, you shall not murder. Anyone who commits murder will be judged as guilty. But I say, anyone who's angry with his brother will be judged as guilty. And then he makes an example of that law, which is new. It sounds to me like he's changing
Hmm.
that judicial system, or that not system, that judicial
Hmm.
law, and then he just makes a practical point so they can understand, because the Sanhedrin is standing and they're still under the law. So he's
Hmm.
making that example, I think.
And they were still doing the sacrifices because he mentioned when he's talking to the crowd still, you go to present your offering at the altar. They were
I
still doing
agree.
the sacrifices.
I
Okay.
agree.
Do you think that the law of Moses taught that it was okay to be angry with your brother?
Um, you shall not. You're referring to anyone who is angry with his brother will be
Right.
judged.
You think the law of Moses didn't teach that it was okay under the law of Moses to be angry with your brother?
Are you referring to a specific
I'm asking you.
verse in?
I'm asking you, do you think that the law of Moses okayed me being angry with Carlos? Let's say we live back there. Do you think it'd be okay for me to be angry with you in disobedience to Matthew 5 there, 21, 22?
Well, if Jesus is saying not to be angry with your brother.
Yeah, my point is you're trying to
Yeah.
say that Jesus is introducing new law here. So he says, you've heard that it's been said, do not murder, the physical act
Mhm.
of murder, but I say unto you, don't be angry with your brother. Some texts say without cause. What I'm saying is, do you think Jesus is introducing new law when he says, don't be angry with your brother?
I think what he's doing is that now being angry with you is the same as killing.
Okay.
That's
Let's
what
move
he's
on.
doing.
Let's move on to
I
another.
think that was not in the law of Moses.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So Luke
All right,
chapter
hey
10.
guys, real
Mhm,
quick,
mhm.
Matthew, time has paused. Want to let you know you got 5 more minutes.
All right.
All
Thanks,
right.
buddy.
Yep.
Let's go to Luke 10,
So,
Carlos.
sorry, is this 10 minutes or 15 minutes, Mike?
20,
Sorry.
20 minutes cross
Oh,
X.
sorry. I
Yeah,
forgot.
yeah, yeah.
Go
Yeah, I
ahead.
had to learn that from you. Luke
Go
10, verse 25. Let's go to Luke 10, 25,
Yes, sir. Luke
25 through
10.
28. Okay. And I hope this don't take the rest of my time up, but if it does, it's
I'll
okay.
try and be quick. Sorry.
A lawyer here asks Jesus, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life, life
Yes.
in the age to come? And Jesus responded by saying, what is written in the law? How do you read it? What law was Jesus referring to here?
The law of Moses.
Okay. So the lawyer responds to Jesus' question by quoting Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 5. All right. The
Yes.
Shema, part of the
Agree.
Shema. So did this lawyer believe in keeping the law of Moses?
Yes.
Okay. So Jesus responds to the lawyer's citation of Deuteronomy by saying, you've answered correctly. Do this and you will live. How
Hmm.
could Jesus agree with the lawyer if he taught a different law than Moses?
Because he didn't come to just, again, abolish the law, leave us lawless.
Hmm.
So he's, again, you know how this works. So he's revising, or some call it spiritualizing, certain laws or whole systems like the Levitical system, because now he's the stand-in, he's the lamb, etc. Although I think you have a different view of that. So, but a lot of the laws, what they call the ethical or moral laws, they're obviously still, the church still is beholden to those laws. That's why I think he said, Matthew, I didn't come to abolish the law, meaning I'm
Mhm.
leaving you guys lawless.
Yeah.
That is why, by the way, in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul is very careful to say, well, listen, to the Jew I become like a Jew, although he's an obvious Jew, Paul.
Okay.
And
All
then he
right. Let me
says,
get.
but I'm
Yeah.
not. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I'll stop you right there. You can stop me too when it's your time.
Of course. Go ahead.
Luke 5, 29 through
Yes.
32, where
Luke
Jesus
5.
eats at a banquet with the sinners.
Yes, sir.
He eats at a banquet with the sinners. The Pharisees get a little upset. Why are you eating with sinners? What does the word sinners mean?
It could mean what I call backsliding Jews or Gentiles.
All right. So backsliding Jews or Gentiles, what do they do? What does that mean to be a sinner?
Well, a sinner is you're in disobedience to, if you're a Jew, the law,
Hmm.
and if you're a Gentile, well, they called us
Hmm.
dogs, as you know. So
Right. So if sinners means those who break the law of Moses, you mentioned this in chapter 1 of your book.
mhm.
What does righteous mean?
Right standing before God,
So sinners means those who break the law of Moses.
disobedience. Yep.
What does righteous mean?
Right standing before God.
Let's go to Mark chapter 7.
Yes, sir.
Mark 7, verse 9.
Yep.
Jesus tells the Pharisees here, you reject the commandment of God that you may
Hmm.
keep your tradition.
Hmm.
And then Jesus in verse 10 says, for Moses said, honor your father and your mother. And he who speaks evil of father or mother must be put to death. Was Jesus equating the commandment of God with what Moses said?
Yes.
And this is in his ministry, right?
Yes.
When Jesus says that Moses said the fifth commandment, was he agreeing with Moses here?
Where? Sorry, fifth
Verse
commandment.
verse 10, Mark 7, verse 10, for Moses said, honor your father and your mother. That's the fifth commandment,
Oh,
Exodus 20,
okay. I
verse
got
12.
you. Yep.
Yeah, so when he says Moses said, honor your father and your mother, was Jesus agreeing with Moses?
Yes, he's upholding the fifth commandment. Yes.
Okay. If Jesus rebuked the Pharisees for setting aside the commandment of God through Moses,
Hmm.
why would he then set aside a commandment of God himself in the following verses?
Jesus is setting aside.
I'll ask it again. If Jesus rebuked the Pharisees for setting aside the commandment of God through Moses in Mark 7, 9 through 10,
Hmm.
he rebuked them for that. Why would he then set aside a commandment of God in verses 15 through 19 of the same chapter. Wouldn't that be hypocritical?
Oh, you mean the food laws, right? Oh, yeah, because in verse 15, nothing which is on the outside and goes into you, meaning food, I think we agreed, can make you unclean. So we have a different interpretation, as you stated, I think, in your opening or rebuttal, of verses 15 and 19. So I side with most
So,
of the translations that say that he declared all foods clean in verse 19. You don't.
yeah, so Jesus is setting aside a commandment of God through Moses in verse 15 through 19.
He is that particular one, we believe, yes, Christians, for the most
But
part, as you know.
but he rebuked the Pharisees for setting aside a commandment of God through Moses in verses 9 through 10,
Yeah,
right?
for their
Okay.
traditions, right? For
Okay.
their traditions. You
All
leave
right.
Thank you. Thank you,
you tend
Carlos.
to
Thank you.
leave out pieces of verses there.
All right,
Yeah.
Matthew, you got time for one more, and then we'll let Carlos have the last
I,
word.
I'm good. I'm good. That's all I want to get to. Yeah, I'm good.
All right,
Thank
all
you,
right.
Carlos. Thank you for answering those questions,
No
buddy.
problem.
All right, thank you, Matthew and Carlos, for that exchange. We're now going to switch over to Carlos for his 20-minute cross-examination of Matthew. And I will go ahead and start the timer when you begin.
Okay, Matthew, let me start here. Do you still slaughter a lamb every year for Passover?
Yes,
Why?
because the law of Yahweh through the agency of Moses teaches me to do that. Specifically in Exodus 12, that would be the initial text right there. So it's a peace or a fellowship offering. It's not a sin sacrifice, but it's a meal among worshipers.
So the Passover was not also for sins?
No, no. The Passover was a shelamim in Hebrew, known as a peace offering or a fellowship offering, fellowship between worshipers of Yahweh. That's what the Passover is. So, yeah.
So it was not a to remind them that God Yahweh forgave their sins.
No, the Passover was not a sin sacrifice.
In 1 Corinthians 5, as you know,
hmm
specifically verse 7. So as you know, Christians do not do that. And I
Sure.
know I saw one of your videos from some time back about why you do it. And you did admit that even within your own community, it is a controversial thing, right? What you're doing,
Oh, yes. I mean,
right?
I get rebuked just like you get rebuked for being a Unitarian. I get rebuked for slaughtering an animal religiously. Yeah.
Right. So how do you understand, Paul? Then one of the big texts,
Yeah.
right, is 1 Corinthians 5:7.
Yeah.
Messiah, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. And
Yes.
as you know,
Amen.
he is called by Paul in Romans 6:10, Peter in 1 Peter 3:18, and Hebrews
Yes.
chapter 9. He's the once for all time sacrifice for our
Yes.
sins, so that
Sure.
most of us understand all that to mean that he has taken our place. I believe in substitutionary atonement. He is our lamb, our Passover. I don't need to kill any animal for any reason. Um, yeah, why do you? I'm just curious.
Well, I mean, Jesus is my teacher, and he kept Passover according to the custom, Luke 2, verse 42. You know, remember when he was 12 years old. So I try to follow my teacher, my rabbi, and do what he did to the best of my ability. I'm not
Well,
perfect, but
he said there, do this in remembrance of what?
he's talking about the bread and the wine. You're going to the Last Supper. So he's
Yeah.
specifically talking about the bread and the wine. Do that in remembrance of him. We do that. We do the memorial supper of the Messiah, of
So why do you
Yeshua.
kill a lamb if you're commanded by your Messiah to remember him in the Passover meal, but why
Because
do you have to kill an animal?
he not only teaches us with his words, he teaches us with his life. And the entire time he was on this earth, every year, except for the one that he died, and he wanted to keep it that year, but he kept the Passover with the lamb. And so he's my rabbi, he's my teacher. So I want to imitate him in all areas that I possibly can. And so that's why I still keep the Passover in obedience to what Yahweh commanded the Israelites and obviously the mixed multitude there that was with them that exited Egypt.
Now, you know the Torah explicitly forbids offering Passover outside the temple, right? Deuteronomy 16, which is why, correct me if I'm wrong, mainstream
Yeah.
Judaism, practicing Judaism today,
Hmm.
do not do what you're doing. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
That's
so
Judah.
you're being more Jew than than an ethnic Jew. Is
Yeah, I
that
believe
right?
I'm correct. Yeah, I believe I'm correct.
Okay.
Just
All
yeah,
right. So you're correct in all of Judaism.
yeah.
Let me move
Can I
on here.
answer Deuteronomy 16, or you want to move on?
I'll move on.
Okay. Okay.
The law of Moses strictly
No,
prohibit.
I'm gonna have to stop that. Matthew gets a chance to respond to that. Thank you. If he wants to respond, he can do that.
Yeah. So Deuteronomy 16 begins in Deuteronomy 12 when you come into the land. And I believe once Israel entered into their place of rest in the land as an established theonomy or theocracy, they were not allowed any longer to do any outside sacrifices. They had to go to the temple stood, and all of that. But in Exodus 12, there was no temple. They weren't in the land, and they slaughtered the Passover, and Yahweh was okay with it. And I consider ourselves to be in that somewhat state or similar state today. So wilderness wandering. Yeah.
The law of Moses strictly prohibits working on the Sabbath.
Hmm.
It's sort of unspecified work, right? Because you have that scary story. I believe it's in the book of Numbers. The guy gathering wood for whatever reason, it doesn't matter. What matters is he's found working, gathering wood. I mean, it could have been a humanitarian reason. We don't know. They bring
No,
him
it
to
wasn't.
Moses, as you know, and they can. Well, the text is silent on that, and
No,
they.
the text speaks. It's not silent.
Okay, what does the text say? Why is he gathering wood?
The episode there is Numbers 15, 32 through 36. And
Yep.
if you just read just above it, verse 30 and 31, and a little bit above that, it differentiates between unintentional sins and what the Hebrew text says, high-handed sins. So right
So
there
you're
it says,
interpreting that as he's sinning then.
I'm
Okay.
interpreting it in context,
Okay,
unintentional
so
and high-handed. And so he must have sinned high-handedly
he
because
must
Yahweh
have.
said,
That's your opinion. He must have then. So let
based on
me
the
get to
text right there in Numbers 15.
right. Well, that's your interpretation. Let me get to my question. So why did Jesus on a Sabbath day stand there, openly declare that he was working on the Sabbath day?
You
John
talking about John
5:17.
5?
John
Yeah.
5:17.
Some work was allowed to be done on the Sabbath. He took the cue from his Father in heaven. His Father in heaven makes people breathe. He lets the sun rise. Sometimes he sends rain on the Sabbath day. And so Yeshua says, I've watched my Father do this type of work. And so I'm going to heal a man that's been diseased for 38 years on the Sabbath. He wasn't doing carpentry work on the Sabbath.
So humanitarian work is an exemption under the law in the letter. Is that what
Yes.
you're saying?
Yes, absolutely.
What
Yes.
verse
Jesus
do
is,
you have for that in the law? Where did
well,
God say, "Oh, if you want to heal someone or rescue your animal or whatever,
well,
you can break
Jesus
the Sabbath"?
explained it. He
No,
explained it
no,
right
what
there.
text in the law?
I,
Give me a
I'm
text.
I'm I'm about to. I'm telling you, Jesus told you already. He said, "Have you not
No, no,
read?
the law. I
Have
want a
Have you not?"
text from the law.
I'm going to answer you like Jesus did. All right. He said, "Have you not read? You should know this, Pharisees. Have you not read?" And he goes to David first, and he mentions David eating showbread, which was not lawful.
Yeah,
Was
those
not
are
lawful.
exceptions that
Look,
Jesus makes the rule. I'm asking you for where did Yahweh,
I'm
your
trying to explain
Yahweh,
it to you.
my Yahweh, say that, oh, rest on the Sabbath except if you want to do X, Y, and Z? Please give me a text.
David was allowed to eat the showbread, which was not lawful
You're
for
not
him to
answering
eat.
my question. Let
I'm
me move
trying
on.
to. If you want to let me, I'll answer if you let me, Carlos.
You're not answering. Matthew
Mm.
17, if I may move on.
Okay.
The temple tax, you know the story well. The
Yeah.
temple tax people, I guess the temple taxman comes along.
Mhm.
Why are they exempt from the temple tax mandated in the letter of the law as far as I can see? Why does Jesus say you're exempt from the law?
There is no commandment in the Torah about an annual half shekel tax. The commandment in Exodus 30 surrounds taking a census. It is not an annual tax. Jesus was not the only Jew that believed that he was exempt. The Qumran community believed they were exempt. The Levite priests argued that they were exempt. Josephus differentiates between the command in Exodus 30 and the custom that's mentioned in Matthew chapter 17. And so there was no law for an annual tax on Jewish people.
That's not what Matthew 17 even hints at. What everything you just said is not in the passage about collecting the half shekel temple tax. Matthew 17:24. People can go and check it out. You just made that whole thing up. Let me move on. Jesus says,
that wasn't a question there. That was a statement. You have a question to ask me?
yeah, I got a next question. Jesus said, you have heard that it was said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth.
All right, listen, I gotta step in here. Okay, so here's the thing. So Carlos, if you don't think he answered the question, make it clear if you want him to answer it, because Matthew, I'll have to, obviously make sure that you answer that question. So Carlos, do you want him to answer that, or do you want to just move on from that?
Yeah, I said I'm moving on. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth in Matthew 5, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. How is this not a direct change of, or let's call it change of the eye for an eye? Show no pity of Deuteronomy 19, verse 21.
Deuteronomy 19 is specifically written to the judges of Israel, not the personal Israelites. It was when they were going over court cases and pronouncing verdicts on criminals.
Yes, I heard that I think in your opening or rebuttal. So I'm trying to understand that position. So how does that work in the church, in our congregations? So are we supposed to set up some kind of a la Sanhedrin system? Is that what I mean, how do we obey Jesus here? I don't understand you.
We obey Jesus by not taking personal vengeance out on people. We are peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers. We don't try to put ourselves in the position of the Sanhedrin or the judges of Israel. So like, the judges of Israel, if somebody steals, my whole flock of sheep and they're caught, they have to repay back 4 sheep for a sheep and 5 cattle for an ox, right? Exodus 22. So that's righteous, but I'm not to take personal vengeance out on my neighbor.
Okay, so if a congregant, someone in your church community, religious community, it kills someone, what Jesus says here, how do you practically then deal with that?
Well,
according
I
to
would,
Jesus?
if somebody in the congregation murders somebody, I would hope that they would get the death penalty.
Right, but I'm saying when you interpret that the law in the letter, eye for an eye, tooth for, was in regards to judicial
punishment, right?
system, not an individual thing.
Right,
But,
exactly.
yeah, but when Jesus says, in my ears, but I'm telling you, do not resist an evil person.
And then he explains it. He goes on to give you the explanation there. Minor infractions, right? Slap on the cheek, taking away the tunic, telling you to go a mile. He didn't say if somebody rapes your wife or murders your kid.
So when he goes on to say, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, and so on.
Right.
So, again, are you under the eye for an eye law? Sorry, I'm trying to understand.
Of course, yes, of course, yeah. We still believe in all of Yahweh's law through Moses.
Okay,
yeah.
Okay, so God forbid, again, I don't mean to be morbid here, but if there is a crime, in your congregation, then you're interpreting Jesus as saying you have a right, Matthew, to take that life, eye for an eye.
Well, I'd go through the judicial system. I would go through the judicial system because the Sanhedrin is non-existent right now. Yeah.
I see. But at that point, in the moment, do you implement eye for an eye?
Oh, self-defense. You mean self-defense?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I would stop the intruder with whatever force necessary. Just like Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew, if the intruder comes in, he has to first bind the strong man, else he can't take the goods of the house. I would be the strong man, so he'd have to bind me first in order to,
Got it. So when you take that life that is trying to harm yourself, your family, your neighbor, when you kill the enemy,
right,
you have fulfilled the law to love your enemy.
Um, love your enemy in Matthew 5:43 through 48 isn't saying that you cannot practice self-defense if somebody's trying to murder your family.
Well, killing someone is not very loving, is it?
Well, I'm doing it out of self-defense. It's either my wife die or the intruder die.
Why didn't Jesus say that, by the way? He
The
could have.
love that the love that Jesus, the way he illustrates it is the sunshine and the rain. He says, "Your Father makes the sun shine on the righteous and the unrighteous and sends rain on the just and the unjust." Those are common graces that Yahweh gives to humanity. Doesn't mean Yahweh loves all of humanity in the exact same way.
You claimed in Matthew 5 still, Matthew 5:17.
Yeah.
You claimed that the word fulfill means to properly interpret. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think fulfill in verse 17
Yes.
is do and teach in verse 19. I think those are equated.
Right. I think in your opening, I'm trying to quote you, to properly interpret. You
Right.
said in your
Yeah.
opening. All right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, what is your evidence for that definition of the Greek there, translated
The,
fulfill?
the entire 5th chapter of Matthew, words are determined by the context in which they're used. So the entire 5th chapter of Matthew is about Yeshua's teaching, juxtaposed to the scribes and Pharisees, verse 20. It's not about Yeshua's life. It's not about what necessarily he's going to do, but it's about what he teaches others to do, how he teaches others. That's why he said, "You've heard that it has been said this, scribes and Pharisees have said this, but I'm going to tell you this. My halakha is better. It is different than theirs in these cases."
I'm trying to understand, Matthew, why you're changing the meaning of a word, and it sounds like you're saying because of the context. Because no translation, as you know, no lexicon that I know, interprets the word translated fulfill as to properly interpret.
Yeah, I'm fine with the word fulfill. I'm fine with the translation, Carlos. I don't have a problem with that. But words are defined, words have no definition apart from their context. You know that.
Yeah, but you're
And so
changing the meaning of a
no.
word that is not one of the meanings for the word.
Hmm.
That's my point. Do you
Yeah.
see? Okay.
No,
If
I don't.
yeah,
Thayer's Greek lexicon actually defines it the way
that's
that
the
I do.
problem.
1 Matthew
Well, any
5:17. So
English language, just any diction. Anyway, if Jesus let's go to Matthew 19, the marriage and divorce issue, as you
sure.
know.
Sure.
If Jesus' teaching there is merely him, I don't know, interpreting or clarifying Moses rather than changing Moses.
Yeah.
So why did Jesus say, so I'm going to read here, Moses permitted you to divorce, and then he gives the reason because their heart were hardness or hardness of heart.
Right.
But he says, from the beginning, it was not so. But I say to you, and then I say to you.
Yeah.
Now, well, let me put it this way. Is Jesus doing away with the certificate of divorce under Moses?
No. No.
That's it.
I mean, I can go into it more. I don't know how much time you want to take.
Well, Moses permitted you to divorce.
Yeah.
5 more
But it
minutes, Carlos.
but it wasn't so from the beginning. So Jesus goes all the way back to Genesis to overturn, it sounds like, the certificate of divorce. And then he
No.
explicitly contrasts and overrides the permission there.
Yeah, a lot of things weren't so from the beginning. It wasn't so to wear clothes from the beginning either. But after the fall of mankind, Yahweh gives laws to regulate how we live.
Right.
In Deuteronomy 24, Yahweh gave a law that protected women. It was for the protection of women. Men were allowed to have multiple wives. It wasn't for the
Right.
protection of the men, but it's for the protection of the woman so she could be loved by a proper man. So if she found no favor in his eyes because he found some unclean or indecent thing in her, he could write out a certificate, put it in her hand, and send her out of his house. She could go be another man's wife.
Sorry,
Jesus is not overturning that in Matthew chapter 19.
Mike, did you say 2 minutes or sorry?
No, you have about 4 more minutes.
Okay, good. Thank you. Let's see. Galatians 5, verse 11. Now you've said that obviously we had a debate about Paul, and
Yeah, that's
you're
not
being
about Jesus, is it? Galatians 5.
right, but you're consistent in and I appreciate that in saying that
Yeah.
Paul says I imitate Messiah Jesus, and Paul was under the law, so it's by extension, right? He's under the law because Jesus was under the law.
He was
And
a
in
good
5,
disciple.
right, in your interpretation, in 5:11 he says, as for me, brothers and sisters, if I were still preaching circumcision, why am I still being persecuted?
Right.
uh, so I think twice there he says, if I were still preaching circumcision, meaning he was not. So why are you?
I invite everybody to go watch that debate Carlos and I had a few years back, and we go over this text extensively. But Paul did not teach circumcision as a prerequisite for the forgiveness of sins. It was particular doctrine of circumcision that Paul did not teach. But he did take Timothy, had the boy circumcised before they started the ministry there in Acts 16. So he must not be against all circumcision of grown adult men.
Why didn't he circumcise, was it Titus?
There was pressure from false brethren that had
Is
came
that what the
in.
text says?
Yeah, he says, "And that because of false
Oh,
brethren."
because of the false brethren,
Yeah, I
I'm
mean,
not circumcising Titus.
Galatians chapter 2, yeah. They
And
were pressuring Titus, and Paul didn't want Titus to think that the act of circumcision forgave his sin, and so he didn't require Titus, he didn't pressure Titus to be circumcised right there.
for the record, I know, but are you under the Sinai covenant in Moses or new covenant in Messiah?
Anybody can go listen to our debate, and you asked me that question, and I answered it about Paul. So this debate's about if Jesus practiced or preached the law of Moses.
If Jesus expects his church to remain under Torah,
Uh-huh.
why was this not the conclusion reached by the Jerusalem Council?
It was. They actually did reach that conclusion. They just didn't plop the entire Torah down on the Gentiles all at one time. That'd be way too big of a yoke for anybody to bear. They started them off with 4 laws, and then they could go to synagogue on Shabbat, Acts 15:21, and they'd hear Moses be preached. And over time, they would grow in grace and knowledge. Yeah.
You wrote that Jesus was not prohibiting all oaths in Matthew 5, and you noted Deuteronomy 6:13 permits swearing in God's name. And
Hmm.
instead, you said he was rejecting the Pharisees' practice of making non-binding oaths by swearing on things, other than the divine name to evade responsibility. And Jesus lists heaven, earth, and so on.
Hmm.
But then you quoted Jesus, and this is in an article, by the way, I read from you.
Hmm.
And you quoted Jesus as saying, don't take this kind of oath at all.
Hmm.
Now, you know that that's not what the Greek says, right?
Hmm. He's explaining what he just said. When he says take no oath at all, that's what you want me to say. Take no oath at all. He's explaining the oaths that he just mentioned against taking. Don't swear by the hair of your head, your beard, a stack of Bibles, your mother's grave, so forth and so on.
Thank you.
You're welcome, buddy.
All right. And that does our 20-minute cross exam from both participants. I want to thank you both. I think that was great. I think overall, it was very respectful. Man, that's the type of discussions I like to listen to. So I thank you both. All right. And now what we are going to do is move to an open audience Q&A for 15 minutes. Now, I have as many questions as I was able to find linked. We're going to take them from the top. But if you have them still, be sure to put them in chat, and hopefully we have enough time to get to all of them. So I'm going to reset this timer, and we are going to start taking these one by one. All right, first up, we have a question from Unitarian Apologetics. Thank you for the question. He says, Hebrews 7:12 says explicitly the law changed. How is a law that is eternal and immutable changed? How do you understand this verse? What law is this? So this is for you, Matthew.
Yeah, I understand change there. Metathesis, I think in the Greek, I understand it to be a transference from earth to heaven. The entirety of the 7th chapter of Hebrews is about the greater priesthood of Yeshua in the heavenly tabernacle after the order of Melchizedek versus the priesthood on earth, on the earthly tabernacle after the order of Aaron. And so the priesthood was transferred from earth to heaven under the ministry of Yeshua. But Hebrews 8, 1 through 4 goes on to say that if Yeshua were on earth, he would not be able to be a priest. It's because he's not after the order of Aaron, showing the order of Aaron still has its place upon the earth in the earthly tabernacle. And if you read Jeremiah 33, which is part of the new covenant, the order of Aaron will be reestablished in the Messianic era. That's part of the new covenant.
All right, Carlos, on to you.
Yeah, it's interesting that that passage there, it says exactly that about Jesus, Matthew, that he's not a priest according to the law. Isn't that ironic? So he's not a priest, so he's disqualified, Jesus. And why? Why did that happen? Well, because God said so. So that's one of the chapters in my book, by the way, because God said so. So why are we changing, quote, eternal laws like the Sabbath, eternal law like circumcision of the flesh? Well, because the word eternal in the Bible sometimes has to be looked at carefully, right? So eternal doesn't always mean eternal. The Levitical priesthood was supposed to be eternal, I believe. Things in the temple, I believe, the keeping oil in the lamps was olam, eternal. So obviously things have to be taken in context. But it's interesting, though, that Jesus is a disqualified high priest under the law that my opponent here is defending tonight. Thank you.
All right, Matthew, the question was for you, so you will get the last word.
Yeah. So the Melchizedek priesthood is in the Torah too, Genesis chapter 14. The author of Hebrews says that Levi paid tithes to Melchizedek in a manner of speaking, being in the loins of his father Abraham. So Melchizedek is the superior priesthood. This is not a new teaching. This is teaching from Bereshith or from Genesis. So Carlos is correct, though, that according to the law of Moses, Yahweh through Moses, Yeshua could not be a priest on earth. The author of Hebrews says that in Hebrews 8, 1 through 4.
All right, thank you. Now moving on to a question we have for Carlos. Did Jesus teach us that his father was a tyrant by saying that his father burdened his people?
Well, actually, the yoke reference, I believe, is in the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. And no, I don't believe God the Father was a tyrant. What's happening is that there is a new system. There's a new lawmaker. There's a new, the new covenant is coming in part. I do agree, by the way, in part, if you read Jeremiah 31, obviously Israel as a corporate nation has not come to believe. So it's in part that we believe that the Messianic era, the Messianic age with the law, the law of Messiah comes in. So yeah, so if you are going back under the shadows, as I understand Paul to be speaking in Colossians 2 and elsewhere, that that is wrong. That is bad. Circumcision of the flesh is now described as cutting yourself off from Messiah. So yeah, that in that way it becomes. But obviously, God the Father is not a tyrant.
Matthew?
In Deuteronomy 6:24, it says that Yahweh commanded Israel the statutes for their good. And in Psalm 19, he calls them more precious than gold and sweeter than honey. I love honey. I eat honey every day, sweeter than honey, right? And then in 2 Kings 23:25, King Josiah shows us about the Shema. It's the only direct parallel to the Shema in the Tanakh. He loved Yahweh. He turned to Yahweh with all his heart, soul, and strength according to the law of Moses. So it's not the laws from a tyrant. These are beautiful instructions that Israel was blessed if they kept.
All right, and Carlos, the question was for you, so you get the last word.
Yeah, I mean, I agree insofar with Matthew, with God the Father not being a tyrant, but things have their purpose. You know, there is a time and a season for things. And again, most of us Christians understand that the Ten Commandments, for example, you know, Paul talks about it in 2 Corinthians 3. He says, written in letters carved on stone tablets, and they came with glory. So looking back, he even calls it the ministry of death in 2 Corinthians 3:7. So you have to take things into context. It does not mean, I agree with Matthew, that God was a tyrant or, oh, he gave them death back in the day. No, it just means that looking back to the former things when you already have the present better things. And again, read Hebrews chapter 8 specifically, where it references Jeremiah 31, by the way, the longest Old Testament reference in the New Testament, Hebrews chapter 8. So, yeah, if you look back to that, that's when it becomes, quote, bad or burdensome. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Nathaniel, for the question. Moving on. A new question by Alive and Remain. This is from Matthew Janzen. If Jesus taught that the law was done away, would that make him a false prophet according to the Bible?
It would. Deuteronomy 13, 1 through 5. It says, if a prophet or a dreamer of dreams rises up from among you and shows you a sign or a wonder and it come to pass, but he doesn't speak in accordance with the Torah, it says, don't listen to that prophet. Yahweh is trying to test you to see if you'll love him or you'll love that prophet. So if Jesus came on the scene and did away with Yahweh's law through the mouth of Moshe, he would have been a false prophet, and it would have disqualified him from being the Hebrew Messiah.
Carlos?
Not if he's the prophet, prophesied by Moses. So if you read a few chapters later, as you know, Matthew, Deuteronomy 18. By the way, Deuteronomy 13 in context, it's about this uh, miracle worker or prophet, and they actually do the miracles and stuff, sign and wonder, it says. But if they teach, it says, let us follow other gods, that's when that's bad. Yeah, in Deuteronomy 18, we believe that Jesus is that the prophet of Deuteronomy 18, as used in the book of Acts, in the preachings of Peter and Paul and others, where they reference Deuteronomy 18. So yeah, so he's the new covenant lawmaker. Again, I stress that in my book and in my opening. So thanks.
Matthew, any other comments?
Deuteronomy 18, Moses says, a prophet like me, not dislike me. Yahweh will raise up a prophet from among the brothers like me, and you are to listen to him. And that was fulfilled in Luke 9:35, Mount of Transfiguration. The voice came down from heaven and said, listen to Jesus, my son. When you listen to Jesus, you're obeying the law of Moses in Deuteronomy 18, verse 15.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Moving on. Another question here from Nathaniel for Carlos. Does John 7:16 through 18 mean that Jesus teaches his Father's law, or does it mean that Jesus makes a law in opposition to his Father?
All right, 7:16. It is not my own teaching, but it comes from the one who commissioned me or sent me. If anyone is willing to do God's will, he will fully recognize this teaching, where it comes from God or from my own initiative. The man whose teachings come from himself, the man whose teachings come from himself is looking for glory for himself, but he who is looking for the glory of him who sent him, that man is genuine and there is nothing false about him. Does that mean that Jesus teaches his father? Does it mean that Jesus makes? Yeah, Jesus is teaching what he's hearing or seeing from God the Father. And again, at times, it is clear to us, to most Christians, that some of the things that Jesus is communicating from God the Father, by the way, just to clear up something I saw in the chat, when we say the law of Moses, that is a biblical phrase. It's not that Moses made it up, obviously, but it is a biblical phrase. Jesus himself uh, says the law of Moses. So yeah, when we talk about the law of Jesus, it just means that their laws communicated originally from God to Jesus in the case of the old covenant, as we call it, from Moses. So does it mean that Jesus makes law in opposition? No, that passage there clearly is not in opposition to God the Father.
Thank you. Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that Jesus only teaches his Father Yahweh's instructions. So, and we can find those instructions in the first 5 books of Scripture in the Pentateuch. And I think Jesus practiced and preached Yahweh's law.
All right. Thank you for that. Carlos, you have any last words on
Yeah,
that?
just quickly, the words of the new covenant, where do we find them? Well, we know where to find the words of the old covenant. Well, the words of the new covenant a good place to start is the Sermon on the Mount. So now they're the words and commandments from Messiah, not Moses. And yes, Messiah doesn't totally abolish, do away with, renounce the whole of the Mosaic laws, etc. But obviously there are things that are different to us. So yeah.
All right, awesome. I want to do a quick lightning round. This will be just one response from both of you. First to you, Carlos. Is Carlos implying that Christ transgressed the commandment? Confused. You want to clarify on that?
No, I look at my what I call disclaimer in my opening. Jesus was not a lawbreaker. He's the new covenant lawmaker.
Matthew, any comments?
I disagree with Carlos's understanding of the law that Jesus kept, but I respect Carlos in the sense that he actually believes in living a Christian life and obeying laws. So I have to respect that. So, I think he's wrong in his understanding. I think that his teaching presents Jesus as a lawbreaker, but I know he doesn't think that. So, hopefully that made sense.
All right, thank you both. Just wanted to get that one out. Okay, question for Matthew. Does the Bible teach in the Old Testament that the law of Moses will come forth from Jerusalem, meaning heaven?
I think that's part of the kingdom promise in Isaiah 2:2-4. Come, let us go up to the mountain of Yahweh and to the house of the Elohim of Yaakov. He will teach us his ways. We will walk in his paths. For the Torah will go forth from Zion, and the word of Yahweh. Notice the word of Yahweh is synonymous with the Torah. It will go forth from Jerusalem. And I think it's a kingdom prophecy because then it talks about there'll be no war. We'll beat our swords into plowshares, our spears into pruning hooks. Praise Almighty Yah for that time when it comes. So I do think that, that it will. And I also think the same thing at the end of Isaiah, from one new moon to another and from one Sabbath to another, all flesh will come to worship before Yahweh in the new heavens and the new earth even. So yeah.
Quick, Carlos, before you respond, I think he dropped another question. It's sort of the same one. So will Christians be keeping the law of Moses in heaven for eternity? You're saying yes.
For me?
Yes.
Okay, so I do think there will come a point in time when all will be accomplished and some jots and tittles will pass. It doesn't mean that the final new heavens and new earth will be lawless, but it'll be a stage that we get to. Remember, Yeshua said, until heaven and earth pass away. In Revelation 21, what happens? I saw heaven and earth pass away. All right. So there will be some jots and tittles passed at that time, but not until that time. So the first stage of the kingdom, I think Carlos and I agree with the millennium kingdom. So the first stage of the kingdom, I think, will be sons of
Thank
Aaron.
God.
I think there'll be a temple and Yeshua will rule from the throne of David on earth. So yeah.
Awesome. Carlos?
We're going to have to start. So we don't have to debate millennialism. I hope. No, please. I'm sick of millennialism. The question is interesting. First of all, it sounds like the questioner thinks that the final destination for us Christians is heaven. In heaven. No, we're not going to heaven. I'm not going to be in heaven. I'm waiting for the kingdom to come to earth. I agree with Matthew. The prophets talk about the law coming forth from Zion. That's not in heaven. That'll be on earth. Reconstituted, reborn. Check out Matthew 19:28 at the restoration, rebirth of all things. Messiah will sit on his glorious throne. The Davidic kingdom will be restored, etc. I believe that'll be a physical restored Zion, Jerusalem in the Middle East. Now the nations will be keeping the law in a sort of modified form. I do believe that, Matthew. I will not go against Zechariah.
Praise the Lord.
Yep, I will not go against Isaiah 65, 66, Zechariah 14, Ezekiel 36. There is a prophecies about certain feast, festival of booths, I believe.
Yes.
The Sabbath, even circumcision of the flesh in the temple. I believe in a physical, literal, millennial temple, first stage of the kingdom. Thank God you believe that, Matthew. But that is for the nations, I believe. It's not for now. I believe we are the Israel of God, Galatians 6:16, 1 Peter 3. I think now those Old Testament Israel things are applied to the new international Jew or Gentile, you know, irrespective of ethnicity. So I do believe in a modified form, The Mosaic system will be brought back. A physical temple, of course, means the reinstitution of those things, but it's for the nations. Just read the prophets. It clearly says that, not, I believe, for the church.
All right, Matthew, any final thoughts on that?
No, I'm good. We can move on.
Okay, awesome. Let's do another quick lightning round response from both of you. We're coming up on the end of our time here. So Hebrews 7:12, for the priesthood being changed, there is made a necessity of change also of the law. Could both of you state what this means to you, starting with you, Carlos?
Yeah, I believe just what it says. If you read it in context, again, we have different interpretations here, but in context, Hebrews is painting a picture. Picture a house, and you have the foundations of a house, and the foundation a writer seems to be saying, is the Levitical priesthood, and upon that system, the law, the building is erected, is put on top of that. The coming of Messiah, and I agree with Matthew again. Yes, Melchizedek priesthood goes back to Genesis, one of the 5 books of the Torah. Yes, I agree, but it's before the Sinai system. So God goes back to the beginning before the law, and God says, well, yes, he's not from the tribe of Levi that I said was eternal, eternal priesthood. He's not, but I'm going before then, and he makes Jesus the supreme high priest, not according to the law in the letter. So that's key. And then I think what's happening there in Hebrews 7:12 is that there's a change. So the foundation, the original foundation, is gone. So I believe change is change. It's different, and now there's a new law. It goes on to talk about Hebrews. Hebrews is very important, by the way, for this topic. The whole letter of Hebrews. Please read it carefully, and it goes on to talk about how there's a new legislation, if you will, a new law enacted of Messiah. In I think it's Hebrews 9:16 from memory, something like that. Thank you.
Matthew?
So I take Hebrews 7:12 as the Douay Rheims Bible does for the priesthood being translated. There's made of necessity a translation, also the law, which the same word is in Hebrews 11, verse 5. By faith, Enoch was translated that he should not see death. So I see it as being there's a greater priesthood in Yeshua, but not on the earth. It's in the heavenly tabernacle. So he's just not up there sitting at the right hand of the Father and just not doing anything. He has duties in the heavenly tabernacle. So I take that priesthood to be superior, and that's not a new teaching. That's a teaching that goes back to the book of Genesis, chapter 14. Let me add here, too, that I would ask everybody to carefully read Jeremiah 31, beginning at verse 31, but don't stop at verse 35. Continue to read all chapter 31, chapter 32, and chapter 33. All 3 chapters are new covenant promises. And part of the new covenant promise in Jeremiah 33 is a restoration, not just of the throne of David, but of the sons of Aaron. The sons of Aaron will be offering sacrifices in that millennium kingdom, in that temple. That's part of the new covenant promise. Behold, the days come, saith Yahweh. And he mentions the sons of Aaron. I challenge everybody to go back and study that.
Yeah, is it me? Can I?
Sure, you can make one more comment. We only have a few more questions. We want to be respectful of both your time tonight. But yeah, sure, if you want to make one more, then we'll get these last 2 and call it.
Surprise, Matthew. I agree. Again, I agree with that last statement. I cannot overturn the prophecy. There's too many prophecies talking about a physical. I mean, 8 chapters of Ezekiel cannot be metaphoricized, or what's the word? It's not spiritual. If Ezekiel 40 to 48. I mean, to me, that's a literal thing. I believe you're right. A recommencement of the Mosaic system. Just quickly note Hebrews 7, right? Keep reading Hebrews 7:12, change of law. Look at verse 18, Hebrews 7:18. On the one hand, a former commandment, that's a law, is set aside because it was weak and useless. Thank you.
All right, just sort of breaking some rules there. We'd love to give.
Okay.
It's all good. All right, let's move on. Next question from Power Tool Apologetics. He says, question for Carlos. Acts 15, verses 20 through 21. If the council determined that Gentiles only had to follow those 4 laws, then why was the law of Moses read to them every Sabbath?
Yeah, that has nothing to do. It goes on to say that, yeah, let's see, I'll just read it here. The judgment is this: we do not trouble those among Gentiles who are turning to God, but that we write to them that they abstain. And then they give a list in verse 20, 21. For Moses from generations past has had in every city those who proclaim him, since he is read out loud in the synagogue every Sabbath. Yes, I've heard that it's very popular to read this as saying, oh, okay, so Gentiles should only do these laws because they need to go to the synagogue where Moses is read every Sabbath. I mean, I don't see the connection. I can sort of maybe understand how that interpretation is coming, but again, it's like Jesus. When you add words to Jesus, by the way, or phrases that Jesus didn't say because you believe the context should dictate that you change the meaning of a word. Look, the context here is of a letter. They could have simply said, why go through this whole thing in the council there about, well, let's see, let's think about this and say certain things that make it contradictory to the position of my opponent. Why not just say, from the outset, the whole council is brought about by Jewish Christians. They say, hey, listen, all these Gentiles, we have to get them circumcised so they can obey the law of Moses, which is, by the way, for salvation. Verse 1. So you cannot be saved if you don't do it. That they're right. It is disobedient not to get circumcised, obey the law of Moses. So they're only asking a proper question. Why was the council simply save yourself ink, guys, and papyri? Just say, yep, they're right. Get circumcised, obey the law of Moses. Good night. like, it's not hard. Thank you. Sorry.
All right, Matthew, we'll give you the last word on this one.
Oh, man. So a couple of high points. There are 4 necessary things the Gentiles that were turning to God had to obey. But catch this. In those 4, let's just take one of them, sexual immorality. That goes back to Leviticus 18. There's about 20 to 30 commandments in Leviticus 18. So in just that one command in Acts 15, there's about 30 commands that those Gentiles had to obey from Leviticus 18 now. As a matter of fact, on the 4 things, they're all found in Leviticus chapter 17 and 18. After what chapter? Leviticus 16, the chapter of forgiveness, Yom Kippur. Forgiveness comes first. 4 necessary laws that not just the Israelite, but the Ger that joined to Israel was required to obey. I do think verse 21 means that they would learn the rest of it as they grew in grace and knowledge. Yahweh didn't put a burden on them, plop the entire, as is commonly said, 613 commandments down on the nations that were turning to him. He didn't do that. That would be a yoke that neither we nor our fathers, anybody can't bear that. But the law is beautiful and easy if you just take it one step at a time, and that's what the elders were requiring there of the nations there in Acts 15.
All right. Thank you for that. We're going to go on. There's really 2 here, but this one I think is probably the better one to go for. We are already over time, by the way, folks. All the viewers, you better show appreciation to both Carlos and Matthew. We're keeping them a bit past. We'll end on this, and we'll give them
We're
both
getting tired. We're old men getting
Mike,
tired.
I'm 51 today, so it's my bedtime.
Oh, okay.
Happy birthday, Carlos.
Thank you.
Awesome. Oh, that's great. Okay, let's get this out, and then we'll do some closing statements. So the Bereans were more noble than the Thessalonians, for they received the message with great eagerness and searched the, quote, Old Testament scriptures every day to see if these teachings were true. So let's go ahead, start with you, Matthew, and we'll end with Carlos. What does that mean to you?
I think when they listened to Paul and Silas teach there in Berea, there are 2 things. They were on the edge of their seat. They were eager, noble-minded, I think is a good translation. They would examine the scriptures. Now, the only scriptures available at that time was the Tanakh, the law, the prophets, and the writings. The New Testament hadn't been written yet. Paul's epistles hadn't been written yet, okay, at the time period of the book of Acts. So they would make sure that what Paul and Silas was preaching to them lined up with the Tanakh. That's how they judged the message. I preached a recent sermon on this. So if Paul would say something contrary to Tanakh a red flag would go up. Oh, that's not right. So this is our barometer when we're reading the New Testament. If something we read in the New Testament contradicts the Older Testament or the Tanakh, we're probably not reading it correctly all the way, and we need to reevaluate maybe what we were taught by a particular denomination or person or grandparent maybe, and try to go read something in its original context. Always look for the original intent of the author, not what it means to you, but what the author originally intended it to mean.
All right, Carlos, on to you. The last word for this.
Yeah, specific. I agree very much with Matthew. Context is king. Paul and in Berea, Paul is primarily shown to be preaching the coming kingdom of God, and also the cross, as we say. So he's preaching that, this Messiah, Jesus from Nazareth, that guy whose parents, etc. Well, he turns out he's our Messiah, which means the king of the coming kingdom. So that's a primary message of Paul. So I agree with Matthew. So that's all they had. Obviously, they don't have the book of Revelation or stuff like that. So they're checking what he's saying about this Jesus from Nazareth. Oh, you're saying he's the Messiah, the Christ? Let us check, I don't know, 2 Samuel chapter 7, Psalm 110. So it's primarily to do with Messiah and his resurrection from the dead and what that means, and Gentiles, Greeks coming into the fold as well. So yeah, they're primarily checking their scriptures.
All right. Thank you both so much for answering all those questions, Chad. I hope you appreciate that for them doing that. Let's go ahead. We're just going to give 1 to 2 minutes for each of you to make any closing statements. Matthew, you held the affirmative, so we will go ahead and start with you starting now.
I always appreciate Carlos. He's a nice guy. It gets a little spicy in the cross-ex, but that's okay. I've never saw a cross-ex that didn't get a little bit spicy. Let me give you some recommended reading to help you with your studies. First one is The Sabbath Breaker by D. Thomas Lancaster. This is a short book, all right? This is going to help you understand Yeshua and his Sabbath keeping or breaking episodes. Jesus and the Law of Moses. This is a recent book that came out, 2025, 250 page plus. Paul Sloan. Excellent book that will help you understand the Gospels. This is for my heavy hitters right here. This is going to be close to 500. This is Torah Praxis by Isaac Oliver. All right. You need to get this for your library to help you study Matthew, Mark, and Luke specifically. And then last but not least, I will send this for free to anybody that contacts me. This is a book I self-published in 2011, Learning to Love His Law, Training Our Minds to Think Like the Creator. All right, this is a small print, but it's about 150, 160 pages. I'll send this to you for free if you contact me. All right. So I just appreciate Carlos. I hope that you'll read those books with an open Bible, not to the neglect of the Bible. Search the scriptures to see if these things be so. Don't take my word or Carlos's word for anything. Use this debate. Listen to it again. Go back over it 2, 3, 4 times. Listen to the questions and the answers. Listen to the affirmatives and the rebuttals. Take notes, make a flow chart, all right? See who stayed with the scriptures. Look up words in Hebrew and Greek lexicons. Define words by their context. Look at what the scholars say. I think you'll be blessed. Shalom, shalom.
All right, thank you for that, Matthew. And now on to Carlos for any other final statements that you would like to make.
Yes, thanks to Matthew. It's important to acknowledge for me that many who adopt this opposing view, Torah observant, do so from obviously sincere and admirable motives, obedience. Now, some do it to seek deeper roots, connections, a desire to know the Jesus who was a Jew, was born a Jew under the law, etc. But these longings, again, they're understandable to me, but sincere motives do not erase serious covenantal consequences. I mean, once Torah keeping is introduced as a binding requirement for Christianity, the result is no longer, I believe, a return to the original faith of Jesus. It's the beginning of a reconstruction of Jesus and the faith of our Messiah Jesus. Now, yes, Christianity seeks to engage, to understand, to learn from the Jewish heritage, from the books of Moses. I'm not saying don't read the Old Testament. Please, it's essential for your kingdom gospel message to read the great prophets, Isaiah, Zechariah. I mean, one of my favorite chapters is Isaiah chapter 19. Now, we treasure the Torah, the scriptures. They are still the scriptures after all. We do call them that, Christians. But treating Torah observance as continuing covenantal obligation for Christians fundamentally alters the shape of the Christian faith. And to call yourself a Torah observant Christian, to me, is similar to calling yourself a Muslim Christian or a Confucian Christian. You know, Confucianism and Christianity. It's well intentioned, but ultimately contradictory, blending distinct religions rather than restoring the ancient faith of our precious, beloved Messiah Jesus. You're creating a new thing. True Christian faith honors the Torah, honors the prophets as scripture, but we must embrace Jesus as the new covenant lawmaker, mediator of a new and better covenant. Please read carefully the letter to the Hebrews. And we stand firmly and solely within the teachings, the commandments of our Messiah and his apostles, not Moses. Thank you.
All right, guys, that's going to do it for this debate. If you want to hear more from Matthew or Carlos, be sure to visit their channels. They have been linked in the comments. They should also be linked in the video description. Big shout out to them. And we thank all of you guys as well for joining us tonight. Be sure to like this video. Oh, as my camera just jumped. Oh my gosh. Oh no. Can you hear me? Give me a moment, my camera. Oh no. All right. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like, subscribe if you